That's a good question. Economists like to think we can answer many questions. Of course, this coexistence can be related to religious coexistence, the coexistence between nature and humans, and of course other examples such as GM crops and non-GM crops coexisting together. So you can approach this from an economist or biological perspective, of course, and we're going to concentrate today on how economists attack this problem. Now, economists by nature, we're famed for our kind of rather dismal outlook on life, and you might expect the inevitable conclusion here is that economists will come to the conclusion that there is no existence is going to be the eventual outcome here, because there are a number of very difficult obstacles that we need to overcome in the future, and hopefully I'll discuss some of these today. Now, my particular area of interest is the economics of globalization. That takes into account environmental economics, it takes into account international trade, foreign direct investment, multinationals, and of course migration, which is also another important aspect, and that's going to be very closely linked to the environmental impact of climate change and of globalization. So if we go back to the beginning and we talk about what is the definition of economics. So Lionel Robbins in 1932 effectively talked about economics as the use of scarce resources. So it's scarcity that's the most important thing here. Adam Smith in 1776, again the father of economics, defined economics as an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So if we start off with a number of examples, so economists would think, we talk about equilibrium. So you may have an equilibrium. An equilibrium is then shocked. That can be a shock, it can be economic shock, such as a global financial crisis. It can be a political shock, such as a coup or revolution, or it can be a natural a shock caused by nature, such as an earthquake or a hurricane, as we've seen recently in Japan with the earthquakes, and we've seen in the US recently with the hurricanes. We then look at how an economy responds to those shocks. And one example, you could even think about these shocks in terms of Iraq. If you think of Iraq, it was a stable, although unpleasant, equilibrium under Saddam Hussein. The Americans came in, a relatively stable equilibrium. The Americans are leaving, and now we have a large increase in turmoil and bombings and so forth. The question we have to ask is, will we reach a peaceful coexistence in Iraq between the Kurds and the Shias and the Sunni Muslims, or will it end up in the breakup of the country? If you look at Yugoslavia, a stable equilibrium under communism for many years, and then the end of communism, and the result, Yugoslavia split into a number of different countries. So we have to look at this from economic and political boundaries, and Africa is another very good example. The boundaries in Africa were largely politically formed. Were those boundaries in the correct place? We have ethnic differences, we have tribal differences, we have differences in religion, and this is causing considerable problems even today. So the question is how economics can address some of these issues. And in all cases, it's not easy. Let's take an example of one of my research interests, which is the economics of climate change. There have been long negotiations over climate change. How can we stop the constant emission of CO2? It's reached record levels, reached over 400 million ppm very recently. The West is telling developing countries, you've got to slow down your emissions of pollution. But of course, the developing countries are saying, well, you grew on the back of pollution. We surely have a right to also grow and pollute, because poverty levels are so high in our countries. Who are you to tell us to stop? CO2 can be in the atmosphere for up to 100 years. So a lot of the pollution in the atmosphere at the moment was caused by the West, and now we're trying to stop developing countries developing as we did previously. This will cause, so this is the stalemate we're currently in. The West does not want to unilaterally reduce emissions. Why? Because then we'd lose jobs, and jobs equal votes. So the US, Australia, Canada are still very reluctant to enter into meaningful climate change negotiations. Europe led the way, and the result in some respects, is the current crisis in Europe, and Europe is backtracking considerably against its environmental push. So, from the economics perspective, how do we get these big groups, very different groups, to cooperate? The result so far is not great, and it's very difficult to be optimistic that we'll come to a solution in the near future on the economics of climate change. So what can be the solution here? In one aspect, the only way forward really is education. H.G. Wells famously said it's either this human history will develop or it will be catastrophe. It's education or catastrophe. And in some sense, that is what we're looking at now. If we look at the economics of migration, similar, migration can occur for a number of reasons. You might migrate because of poverty, but how is that poverty caused? The poverty may be caused by changes in the climate, which leads to falls in the crop yields, which force widespread migration of people. This is not happening on a wide scale yet, but it's likely to in the future. What happens then? That then puts pressure on the scarce resources in the host country, in terms of hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and a number of other issues. And that causes tension between the migrants and the people who already exist, who are already living there. And these are difficult problems to overcome, and are all challenges we're going to have to face in the future. The economist solution on the debate on nature and climate, nature and human existence, coexistence, what the UK is trying to do is there is a valuing nature network that's been set up, and the aim here is to value nature in some way. Now, this is controversial, and there is a workshop in the near future which is under the title of Putting a Price on the Priceless, Valuing Nature. So some people you say you can't value nature. But if we are to prevent continued environmental degradation and environmental catastrophe, we have to somehow put a price on nature. What is the price of a park? What is the price of a forest? What is the price of biodiversity and a number of the different species in the UK and around the world? If we lose species go extinct, is there a cost? What's the cost of this? And there is a large literature on this. People prefer to save cuddly animals like pandas, stick insects and so forth are kind of less popular, and people seem to be willing to pay less to save less attractive looking creatures. So we have to take all this into account. So the UK is trying very carefully to value nature. If we can put a price on nature, we can then charge for pollution, and we can put a price on saving forests, on saving biodiversity. Without that, we'll get continued environmental degradation, we'll get deforestation, we'll get desertification, we'll get loss of species, and coexistence will be increasingly hard to achieve. So that's a general overview of how economics can address the question of coexistence or no existence. Many economists would say no existence is inevitable, but we have at least to try and value nature, value coexistence, and cooperation led through education, which is why initiatives such as this are so valuable and certainly supported by the University of Birmingham.
Well, that isn't the motto of the Centre for the Study of Global Ethics, but it almost could be, because the whole point of the Centre's existence is that there are ethical issues, ethical problems, challenges facing the world which transcend national boundaries, which go beyond the ability of any particular nation state to deal with them. And the reason for that is because we're all interconnected. The statement, no existence without coexistence, is simply true. Everything that exists in the world is in a state of coexistence with everything else. Even if you imagine an uncontacted tribe, you might see on the news sometimes that someone's been discovered somewhere who appears to be isolated from the rest of the world. In actual fact, they're not. The actions that we take are affecting them, even if they don't know it. Probably the most obvious example of this kind of global effect of people's actions is global warming. We all know that the things that we have been doing and are still doing are warming up the world, and that's having various effects. And we know that at the level of cooperation between nation states, people are trying to do something about that. There have been various agreements, treaties, and so on. Maybe they haven't gone far enough. One thing that we might think is that thinking of ourselves as members of nation states isn't really an adequate way of responding to the problem. We need to start thinking of ourselves as citizens of the world, as all being part of a single human race with a shared problem. And then we should stop thinking of ourselves as maybe having a national answer to the problem which we are going to adopt, where other people in other parts of the world will have different solutions to that problem, or maybe not address the problem at all. We've got to look at it as a single problem we're going to address together. Brookhouse School in Kenya sent in several excellent questions, and I was struck by the fact that there's a shared feature of many of them, perhaps not all of them, and that is that they concern issues surrounding just allocation of resources. So we've got different groups who are competing for resources, and the issue is how can we arrange the allocation of those resources in a way which is just. So this implicitly raises the question of what counts as justice in this kind of scenario. One interesting thought, which is very much at the centre of the work of the Centre for the Study of Global Ethics, is that we need a better theory of global justice. So until relatively recently in political philosophy, theories of justice were at the level of the nation state. How can the nation make sure that it's taking care of the poorest while allowing for entrepreneurship and people to benefit from their own efforts and that kind of thing? And there wasn't really much work done on global justice. In recent decades, that has changed. And it's possible that if there were better global arrangements, if the allocation of resources globally was more just, some of these local problems wouldn't be so acute. It could well be that it's because of unjust arrangements on a global level that these acute problems arise locally. So, for instance, if there wasn't pressure from the international community, from international trade, on farmers to abandon their own crop growing practices to serve the interests of the developed world by growing monocultures of whatever kind, then there wouldn't be competition between those farmers who have made that move and those who haven't. It's been argued by Professor Thomas Pogge, who is associated with the centre. We've cooperated with him on a number of things. Thomas Pogge has suggested that we have a mistaken view of the relationship between the rich, developed north of the world and the poorer, undeveloped south of the world. We tend to think in the north that what we give is a matter of charity. It's kind of going above what we need to do, beyond our moral duty. And he suggests that, in fact, we who are benefiting from living in the developed north are actually harming people who live in the south, that the arrangements globally at an institutional level are structurally unjust towards people who live in the developing world. And therefore, improving the lives of those people is not a matter of charity. It's a matter of duty. It's our moral obligation, not just to be giving as individuals, but to be changing the institutions which create these problems and pressures. And that's something that we're very interested in at the Centre.
Okay, so the theme that I've been asked to talk about is existence without coexistence. Now, I'm a biologist, and when you think about biology, obviously you're thinking about living things and how they work, but you're not thinking about them individually, like, say, you're looking inside how a car works, because all living things depend on other living things. I mean, the obvious example is a food chain, where one organism eats the other. So the eater can't survive without the eaten. So obviously in food chains, there's no coexistence, there's no existence without coexistence. But if you think about it more widely, I mean, I'm a plant biologist, and I'm interested in how plants survive all the different stresses that the climate change, for example, is throwing at them. And these include things like drought, salinity, high temperatures, pollution, but also the impact of herbivores, the organisms, particularly insects, that eat those plants. Now, obviously, that's really important because with climate change and the growing population, we need to feed more people. So we need our crops to be protected from herbivores. So the herbivore that I'm particularly interested in is the aphid. It's an insect, and it eats plants. It exists in Africa, exists all around the world, But it's not like a cow or a caterpillar that chews the leaf. It's a very specialist sort of herbivore. It's got needles for mouths instead of jaws. And what it does is it inserts its needle-like mouth parts into the plant and finds the transport pathway of the plant, a bit like your blood system, and taps into that plant sap, and that forms its food. Now, the thing about them is, why are they damaging to crops? They're damaging to crops like cereals because, like if you think of a mosquito, that can land on you and suck your blood. Now, you don't lose very much blood, that's not a big problem. But what a mosquito does, it transmits the malarial parasite to you, so you might catch malaria. So the malarial parasite is hitching a ride on the mosquito. Now, aphids on plants are exactly the same. An aphid, if it's infected with a plant virus, when it feeds on a plant, not only does it take sap out of the plant, it also injects a virus into the plant, which then can be devastating to that crop. And lots of cereal crops in Africa and in Europe are affected by these viruses, which severely reduce the yield of these crops and obviously are important in feeding people. So aphids are a bit like the plant mosquito. So the question is, can we think of ways to control them? Now, obviously, pesticides are one solution, but there's big, serious problems with pesticides, which we can talk about in different ways. But if we really want to understand how to control aphids, we need new methods to control them. So we need to understand how the aphid and the plant interact, how they get on, how they're attracted to each other, how they accept each other, in a much more detailed way to identify ways that we can control them more better, or better ways to control them with less of an environmental impact. Now, one of the ways that we've learned to control malaria is by controlling the mosquito. So learning to control the aphid might be one way that we can control these plant viruses. Now, if we think about what the aphid actually eats, it eats the plant, but it doesn't eat all the plant. What it actually eats is sap from the phloem. Now, the phloem, as I said, is like the circulation system of the plant. And it transports sugars from the leaves down to the roots, because obviously the leaves photosynthesize and the roots don't. And it also transports amino acids. Now, amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and aphids need those building blocks to make their own proteins. So you think it'd be quite simple. The aphid sticks its mouth parts in the phloem, takes the amino acids, and it can make its own proteins. But it's not as simple as that, because these amino acids come in two forms. The essential ones, which by definition are the ones the aphid really needs, and the non-essential ones, which it can take or leave them. Now, the problem for the aphid is that plants have evolved a collection of amino acids in this phloem, which are not the right essential amino acids for the aphid. So the aphid is feeding on a diet which isn't good enough for it. It hasn't got the right set of amino acids. So what's he going to do about it? Well, there's a clever evolutionary alliance that's formed, which really is an example of no existence without coexistence, in this case for the aphid. Because the aphid has living inside it a symbiotic bacteria called Buchnera. So Buchnera lives inside the aphid and is protected there and gets some benefits and sugars and somewhere to live from the aphid. And what does it provide the aphid in turn? It provides the aphid with essential amino acids, because what this Buchnera can do is it can take in the non-essential amino acids that the aphid is ingesting, and it converts them into essential amino acids. So the aphid exists because of its coexistence with the Buchnera and vice versa. And you may think, well, that's quite interesting, it's quite a specific example. How do we know that's true? Well, one thing we can do is we can feed antibiotics to the aphid. If we do that, we kill the Buchnera, because the Buchnera is a bacterium, just like if you have an illness or something. So we can effectively, if you like, cure the aphid of these bacteria. And when we do that and let the aphid feed on a plant, it doesn't do very well at all, it doesn't grow very well, it doesn't reproduce very well, and therefore it's unable to transmit the virus. Now, we're not proposing necessarily that we feed individual aphids with antibiotics in order to control them. But what we are thinking about is, by understanding the relationship between the bacterium, between the aphid and between the plant, we can get new clues, new ways that we could control these aphids and therefore reduce the virus transmission and therefore the effect on crop yield. Now, those may be genetic modification, they may be conventional plant breeding, or they may be changes in farming practices and management in a more traditional way. But all of those will benefit from a better understanding of the plant-aphid interaction.
One of the big pressures on the world is population growth. Population growth is still considerable, and there's always pressure on land. And this, again, is leading to deforestation and so forth. And of course, national parks are increasingly hard to set up when there is this pressure. And we've seen the rise of China and other countries has led to considerable increase in poaching for rhino and elephant horns. And this is going to cause considerable problems. It comes back to being able to value nature. Increased population pressures will cause considerable difficulty for governments in certainly setting up new parks. It all comes down to valuing nature. We have to be able to put a price on nature, and we have to be able to allow the public and the voters to appreciate the natural resource which is available to them. Now, in developing countries, this is particularly difficult, especially when, and again, it links back to poverty. If you can reduce poverty and people have a living wage, then it reduces their incentives to go hunting or poaching or making money through degrading the national parks. But ultimately, there is a difference between developed and developing countries, and one way, and it links to the climate change literature, is that the West may have to fund developing countries to set up these parks, give them support, give them money to patrol wildlife parks and so forth. So it has to be cooperation. The West and developing countries all have to cooperate and explain and educate about the value of protecting national parks and wildlife more generally.
That's an excellent question. It's interesting that the word still is in the question. Does religion still hinder science? So the implication is very clear that it did in the past. I think today the answer is sometimes. Of course, a philosopher is bound to say it depends as the answer to almost every question. There are definitely places in the world where we can see that religious beliefs have stood in the way of science, and sometimes we might think that they have done so in a perfectly appropriate way. On other occasions, we might have more problems with that. Perhaps a more interesting question is whether there is something intrinsic to religion which hinders science, whether religion and scientific progress are necessarily at odds with each other. And you might think that the answer to that question is clearly no, because after all, there are plenty of religious people who do science. There are lots of scientists, very famous scientists in the past, who were themselves religious. Isaac Newton was deeply religious, devoutly religious, and it didn't stand in the way of him being a great scientist. And that's still true today. There are plenty of scientists who are religious believers. My father is a physicist. My mother is a physicist. They both go to church every week. It doesn't stand in the way of the fact that they do experiments in physics. But it can be argued that there's something odd about believing in supernatural beings, believing in supernatural explanations, and at the same time doing science. So there is a school of thought which says, despite the fact that religious believers can do good science, they have to overcome something in order to do good science. They have to take some of their key beliefs and set them on one side when they're doing their job. So when they run their experiments, they rule out the possibility of supernatural explanations. They believe in methodological naturalism, as it's called. And that seems like an extra hurdle for them to get over. Someone who didn't have that kind of religious belief wouldn't have that step to make. So that argument suggests that while religion and science don't have to be in conflict, and religious people can do perfectly good science, the Vatican, for instance, has a very good astronomer who does perfectly good astronomy and cosmology. While that's true, there's still some tension there. The other interesting question is, what kind of religious belief are we talking about? Because I was referring to supernatural explanations, implicitly I was talking about belief in God as a creator of the world and that kind of thing. But not everything that gets called a religion has that kind of belief. Not all religions are monotheistic religions. Not all religions have the same kinds of appeals to the supernatural. So to answer the question, does religion hinder science, is tricky. It depends on the religion. It depends on just what set of circumstances we're talking about. And so the philosopher's answer is, it depends. Also, if it does, there's still a further question about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It might be that a religious person says, we mustn't do this kind of research because it's unethical. And their reasons for thinking that it's unethical are religiously inspired. But we might all agree with them. If someone said to you, you mustn't do research on this person who has not given his consent, it would be an affront to his human dignity, they might be basing that belief on thinking that human beings are formed in the image of God and that it's an affront to them for that reason. Now, we might not share that reason, but we might agree with their conclusion and think that this religiously inspired hindrance of science was perfectly good. If, on the other hand, someone said, we shouldn't do research into global warming because God would not permit this to happen, we might think that that was much more troubling and that this was a bad instance of religion hindering science. So I'm afraid we just have to judge on a case-by-case basis.
Well, that's a really interesting question and obviously a very topical one. Just say a little bit about the question first. You say the pressure to use pesticides and GM crops. Now, I'm assuming that you think we should use one or the other rather than not any at all. I don't think, given the way that the populations are growing and the population's food preferences are growing, that we can do without pesticides or GM. I think it's fair to say that the simple answer to the question is that ultimately we'll need both. But implicit in your question is that there's some resistance to GM technology, and I'll deal with that in a minute. But I think the first thing is to think about pesticides, because in Europe recently, pesticides and the use of pesticides has come under a lot of scrutiny, and before we consider, say, using GM, we should consider pesticides and what the issues are and the problems with those. Now, there are problems with pesticides. I mean, they're toxic chemicals that we spray on the land. I mean, I think it's something like in the mid-90s, somebody came up with a figure, I think it was the World Health Organization, of something like 2.5 million tons of toxic chemicals were sprayed on crops across the planet. That's a lot of toxic chemicals. Of course, even taking somewhere like the USA, pesticides are dangerous. And I think it's something like 200,000 people were poisoned from pesticides in the USA alone in 1 year in the 90s. So they're not without risks, pesticides. The other risks that are associated with them, apart from human health, are that they can go and kill the things that you're not necessarily wanting to kill. So clearly, if there's an aphid on a crop, you want to spray the aphid, and you don't want it to hurt the beneficial insects that are in the hedgerows, for example, and other parts of the farm. I mean, obviously, pollinators spring to mind because we need pollinators. Otherwise, crops like apples wouldn't get pollinated, and you get a reduced yield. It doesn't obviously affect windborne crops. And there are other organisms, invertebrates, for example, that will eat other insects. And obviously, the more of those that are around, the less pesticides that you have to use. So if those pesticides go out and kill organisms that you're not intending them to, you can have more of an impact than you would want. And also, if you're using pesticides, you've obviously got to buy them, and somebody's got to design them and make them and sell them. So there's a big financial component to it. And also, you get resistance to pesticides. So organisms will evolve resistance to pesticides. So there are issues with pesticides. In the UK, for example, at the moment, there are some pesticides called neonicotinoids, which have been found to have, they've been used on cereal crops to kill aphids, but the residual effects at the edges of the fields have been found to have potentially serious effects on bees. And that's probably one of the components of the decline in bee numbers in this country, and therefore effects on pollination and the apple crops and so on, the other things that bees pollinate. So there are big problems potentially with pesticides. And the fact that they've been banned in Europe, and I think up to 22 have recently been banned, means we haven't got anything else to control those pests with. So another alternative, as your question implies, is genetic modification. Now, genetic modification is simply taking a gene from one organism and putting it in another, and then you've got a new trait, a new way that organism can behave or respond to the environment that it didn't have before. Conventionally, over the last 10,000 years, when we've domesticated crops, we've done that through conventional selection, artificial selection and breeding. The modern genetic molecular techniques allow us to take genes from organisms and put them in different organisms. So that's one of the new things that we're able to do. It's worth pointing out that ever since life evolved on this planet 3.5 billion years ago, organisms have been swapping genes with each other in this way. So it's a perfectly normal thing to happen in the natural world. I don't know if you get it in your country, but in this country we have a disease of trees called crown gall disease, where a big piece of the tree swells up. And that's where bacterium has got into the tree and actually swapped genes with the tree to make the tree make this home for it in its own trunk. So it's not an unnatural thing to do. People say, "Oh, I don't think we should be messing with the world and playing God and things like that," but actually, it's been going on for a long time, and it is a fairly natural phenomenon. The other thing that people say is that genetically modified foods are sort of like Frankenstein foods, and they'll have adverse health effects. But if you think about it just for a minute and take a step back, all the food that you eat, every piece of lettuce, every piece of fruit, vegetable, every piece of meat that you eat has the DNA of other organisms in it. And you've never changed into a cow or a lettuce or a carrot simply by eating them. You just digest the DNA and that's the end of it. So this Frankenstein food argument is not really a sensible one. And it is fair to say, to go back to my argument about pesticides, nobody's ever died from GM food. Lots of people every year die from pesticide poisoning. So what's the other criticism of GM? Well, another criticism of GM is that GM foods, you've effectively put the insecticide, or in the case of if you're making it resistant to, say, like in cotton, there's a gene in there that makes it resistant to the cotton bollworm. So it chews on the plant. The gene that comes from a bacterium actually blocks the protein digestion in the gut of the larva of the caterpillar. It can't digest the food and it dies. And that has protected cotton reasonably well for a number of years. Of course, just like with pesticides, resistance can arise. So there's a problem there. But the debate is also an ecological one, that if you genetically modify a crop, then you affect all the other organisms there, not just the target ones. And there is some truth in that. And there are some studies that show if they're not used and managed properly, that genetic modification can cause problems in the wider ecology of an agronomic situation. But it doesn't have to if it's managed properly. So I think overall, when we think about genetic modification, particularly in Britain, where the pressure on crops isn't so great and we're not so desperate to feed people, as you may be in your country, that we've focused on the risks of genetic modification and not the benefits. And I think the debate is now shifting to the benefits of genetic modification. For example, in your question, you're talking about food production and implying that there's an issue with food production and maybe some debate about whether GM should be used to produce food. But if I told you that we could produce a plant which we could genetically modify and grow that would produce drugs that would cure AIDS, that we could just harvest from the plant, you might have a different feeling about genetic modification. So we're not, so it's a question of what the benefit is. Overall, I think the answer to your question is quite nuanced, and I think that we need lots of different tools to climate change is happening. Rainfall patterns are changing, temperature patterns are changing, and the patterns of the way pests are moving around the globe. New pests are coming into different parts of the world, providing new threats to crops. So we need as many different tools as we can. We need to use GM. We need to use pesticides where appropriate, and we need to use integrated pest management strategies. We need to encourage the natural predators. We need to use planting strategies that encourage friendly insects to come in and discourage the ones that we don't want. So all in all, I think it's just another technology. It isn't dangerous inherently in itself. It's only as dangerous as bad use of it. And I think to answer your question, if you pushed me, I'd have to say yes, I think we should be using GM more. I think we should probably be using pesticides a bit less. But I think we need all the strategies.